The aim of the coup in Bolivia was to destroy the social movements that had built their own political party, which was the movement towards socialism, Evo Morales' party. However, they weren't able to crush the organization, even though they persecuted the leaders, sent the top figures into exile, jailed. Um, in reality, what happened is that the movement towards socialism is more than a few figureheads. If that were the case, it would have disappeared with the persecution of a few people. But the reality is that it's a coalition of social movements, trade unions, indigenous groups in every single region of the country, in the Andes, in the tropics, in the east, in the Amazonian areas. So the coup wasn't able to crush that because it's something that's implanted in every single rural community, in the working class neighborhoods of the big cities. So taking out a few people through persecution is not going to wipe away a movement that is that rooted in the lives of ordinary people in Bolivia. Immediately after the coup took power, there were two massacres. First in Sacaba, and that was a massacre of people in this region, in the Tropic of Cochabamba. This is where Evo Morales used to be a union leader. And people from this region were trying to march to the city. However, when they got close, um, the police stopped them, and then military helicopters flew about 40 meters above the ground, shooting at the crowd. 11 people were executed that day. And then a few days later, there was a second massacre in the city of El Alto, which is an overwhelmingly indigenous city, sort of next to La Paz. And people there were protesting against the coup for the return of Evo Morales. And people again were executed. And 9, 10 people were executed that day. So that is the demand for justice for those massacres has been the key demand throughout this year of the social movements that have overturned the coup. And now that the mass has retaken power, now that the social movements once again are participating in the exercise of power, the process of creating justice has already begun. Already there is detention orders for the Interior Minister Arturo Murillo and the Defense Minister Fernando Lopez, who the ones who ordered the executions in Sacaba and Sencata. However, they've already escaped to the United States. There will be efforts to try and extradite them. There are also charges already being put against the former self-declared president, Janine Áñez. And when she tried to escape to Brazil just a few days ago, social movements in a town of Trinidad in the department of Beni surrounded her neighborhood and wouldn't let her leave. So people were determined to get justice, and that process has already begun. And it wasn't just the massacres that took place. After the massacres, what began was an incredibly deep persecution against the most prominent leftists in Bolivia, and that is union leaders, former ministers in Evo Morales' government. Those I worked with, union leaders I worked with in this region, people like Andronico Rodriguez, Leonardo Losa, both are now senators. However, just a few months ago, they had more than 15 criminal charges brought against them each for things like terrorism, sedition, questioning the legitimacy of the government was considered sedition, organizing a protest was considered terrorism, and that were the charges that are hanging over them. And there were many moments when they're on the verge of being arrested and jailed. However, I think something that warded the state off from doing that was the strength of organization. They knew that if they took these leaders of the people, the country would be lit on fire. So it was that organization of people, even in the face of persecution, that kept the party going throughout the year of the coup, and to be able to then go into the elections as the largest movement in the country and win. Solidarity was so important, and I think will continue to be important because it made Bolivians realize that they weren't fighting alone. The level of the persecution, of the discrimination, racial discrimination within Bolivia was so thick that people who were fighting from rural indigenous areas or in the working class areas of the city, they sometimes thought that they were fighting alone, that they were going up against an enemy so much more powerful than they were. But when they saw the level of international solidarity, the international journalists from Argentina, from Telesur, coming to share their voice to the world, and getting those messages of solidarity from trade unions, social movements around the world. It gave them an enormous amount of strength. And Evo Morales, I think, has been key in transmitting that international solidarity. There's a huge level of affection for Evo Morales around the world. And he spoke to all the social movements and told them about how the world is watching and the world is supporting the people in the struggle for the return of democracy and against the coup. And that gave an enormous amount of strength to people. But I think also the international solidarity was important because the regime knew that the world was watching. If people didn't care, then I think they would have carried out 2, 3 more massacres. They would have jailed the most well-known union leaders. However, whenever they tried to do that, they were scared off, precisely by the fact that the world was watching. So that was incredibly important, and it continues to be incredibly important. The right in Bolivia hasn't disappeared. Huge sections of the far right in Bolivia, backed by the United States, refuse to recognize the election results and already wanting to unleash a wave of violence in the country. So I think it's important for the international community to know what's going on in Bolivia, to know what the coup was, who are the forces that led the coup, so that when they try to launch that again, people know what's going on. Throughout Evo Morales' period in power, there are attempts to destabilize the government, to launch a coup. They weren't so successful. However, the coup was launched because among Bolivia's middle and upper class, there's a deep-seated resentment and almost a racial humiliation because of the fact that they were being governed by someone who they saw as their social inferior. Evo Morales was a union leader, he was indigenous, and he rose through the ranks of the social struggle and overthrew the middle class who were represented in the old neoliberal republic. And he governed for 14 years. He won 3 elections, 4 elections if you count 2019. And the white middle and upper class felt humiliated by this fact. That was the domestic forces driving the coup. But I think there's also the involvement of the United States, funding for various groups that are involved in the coup, support for the narrative that there was electoral fraud last year, a narrative we now know was completely flawed and manipulated. And the United States has its own set of interests. Evo Morales, the popular socialist leader, anti-imperialist leader who opposed the influence of the United States in Latin America. And Bolivia is also sitting on the largest lithium supplies in the world. And Evo Morales wasn't planning to privatize those lithium supplies. He wasn't planning to extract and send the cheap raw materials abroad for factories in the West to process. What Evo Morales was trying to do was have the extraction process and a process of industrialization under the state-owned company, Bolivia's state-owned lithium company, to create a value-added final product. The United States was completely opposed to that. The United States model of interacting with the global South is to buy up cheap raw materials and do the manufacturing and industrial work in the global North. Evo Morales was destabilizing that model, and that's why he had to go. And that's why the United States intervened to sweep him away. Yeah, I think the OAS, people around the world may see the name and see it as some neutral inter Latin American body. The reality is it's always been an activist organization. The OAS was created after the Cuban Revolution with the aim of isolating the Cuban people at a regional level and tying together the right-wing governments of Latin America under the command of the United States. And it still plays that role today. In Venezuela, it's promoting a military intervention, it's promoting sanctions that are starving the Venezuelan people. And in Bolivia, they produced a report that indicated that there had been electoral fraud last year under Evo Morales. However, every study since then in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, by researchers at MIT, by the Center for Economic and Policy Research, have shown that that whole report was full of flaws, full of coding errors, full of very basic mistakes throughout the report. But it was something that was produced to bring the country into chaos. When that report was published, Bolivia was already mired and far-right violence. The houses of leftists were being burnt down, indigenous people were being attacked on the streets, and that report added fuel to the fire and allowed and gave the military an excuse to step in, intervene, and launch the coup, to finalize the coup. So I hope going forward, those people around the world can see that the OAS is not a neutral international body. It's an organization that exists in force US interest in Latin America. Bolivia is sitting on the world's largest supply of lithium, and lithium is incredibly important because it's something that goes in batteries and things such as electric cars. It's been called the mineral of the future to build the technology of the future, and that's why countries like the United States are desperate to get their hands on it. That's why oligarchs like Elon Musk are desperate to get their hands on it. And in fact, he bragged on Twitter about his involvement in the coup in Bolivia, saying, "We'll coup whoever we want, deal with it." That's how the oligarchy in the United States, the ruling class in the United States, views natural resources in Latin America. They view it as their own property. However, what Bolivia did was take it back and tell them, no, this isn't your property, this is our property, and we're going to use it to benefit the Bolivian people and to bring people out of poverty. If we talk about media coverage, there's obviously two categories, the Bolivian media and the international media. The Bolivian media, despite all the accusations that Evo Morales is authoritarian or a dictator, the reality is that every single private media institution had an editorial line critical of Evo Morales, highly critical, attacking Evo Morales' government throughout the 14 years in power. The only media outlets that defended the government at that time were the state media outlets, TV channel, radio station, and the newspaper. Once the coup took place, even those were swept away. So Bolivians were fighting against not just the coup, not just a state, but also against the infrastructure of the media, who, despite the fact that the movement towards socialism represents a majority of Bolivians, the only sources of information in the mainstream media were waging an information war against the majority of the Bolivian people and the party that they supported. So people had to face that down as well. In the international media, during the coup, it was really disappointing to see big sort of mainstream liberal outlets such as the New York Times, the Guardian, talking about the Bolivian people are protesting against Evo Morales. A question they didn't ask was which people? There were Bolivians protesting against Evo Morales last year, but where were the protests taking place? They were taking place in the Zona Sur of La Paz, the wealthiest area of La Paz, in the Zona Norte of Cochabamba, the wealthiest area of Cochabamba, in the first few rings of Santa Cruz, which are the wealthiest areas of Santa Cruz. These protests weren't taking place in working class areas of the cities. These protests weren't taking place in indigenous rural areas. So all of that majority of the country weren't recognized as the Bolivian people. And when they came out to protest in favor of Evo Morales and against the coup, they were portrayed as terrorists and criminals. As we go forward, for the future Bolivia coverage, it is important to recognize that key failing that there was in the mainstream media in the West, both the liberal, progressive sections of that and the more conservative sections, who swallowed a narrative of describing the Bolivian people as a very small section of the country's middle and upper class who are protesting against the country's first indigenous president. In some ways, there are some parallels. Donald Trump was making completely unfounded allegations of electoral fraud in an attempt to destabilize the country and its processes. That's exactly what happened in Bolivia. The main opposition candidate, neoliberal centrist candidate Carlos Mesa, declared that there'd been electoral fraud without a shred of evidence. And then following that was Marco Rubio, with the OAS to back him up. And what that did was unleash a wave of far-right violence in the country. However, it's somewhat annoying and absurd in some ways to hear narratives from liberal sections of the United States about a coup taking place in their country, or about things like Russian meddling and intervention in their elections. The reality is that the liberal section of American politics, the Democratic Party, and Democratic administrations, have always supported coups in Latin America. The last coup that took place before Bolivia was the coup in Honduras 12 years ago, in which the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, played a hugely important role. And 12 years later, the country is still mired in crisis and right-wing rule. So, this idea that this hyperbole from liberals in the United States, it reeks of hypocrisy, certainly for those in Latin America who have been victim of US intervention from democratic administrations. The new president is Luis Arce Catacora, and he was the economy minister throughout the whole of Evo Morales' government. He built the economic model that turned Bolivia from the poorest country in the region into its fastest growing economy. And he did that by applying the model known as the social communitarian model, which consists of nationalizing natural resources and strategic industries, and mobilizing those resources, running state industries efficiently, and using those profits to invest in state development, in infrastructure spending, in public services. And that's how Bolivia was pulled out of a very serious level of poverty that was left in by the previous neoliberal administrations that had indebted the country to the IMF. And before going into politics, before becoming the Minister for Economy, Luis Arce was well known among certain intellectual academic circles in La Paz. He was well known for running a sort of Marxist study circle based around study of economics, and specifically focus on how countries can build post-neoliberal economies. So I think the model he built in Bolivia, the socialist model he built in Bolivia, I think is something that should be studied around the world. The way in which the state can take control of the most important sections of the economy, run them democratically, and for the benefit of the majority of the people. After the coup, there was a number of figures and leaders that could have taken the spot, but I think choosing Luis Arce Catacora was a hugely important decision, because as someone who led the rapid economic growth in Bolivia on the basis of nationalizing key industries, he had a huge amount of respect in the country, not just in its traditional bases in the rural and working class areas, but also in some sections of the middle class. No one could argue with his record of delivering economic growth and pulling Bolivians out of poverty. So I think it's especially important that someone like him, an economist, is in this role, because Bolivia is once again in a horrific economic crisis, not just because of the pandemic, but because of the fact that during the past year of the coup, the coup regime took out hundreds of millions in IMF loans. They destroyed the economy by privatizing certain state industries and paralyzing key state development projects, such as the industrialization of lithium, such as key industrial and public transport projects. And this austerity and neoliberal approach turned Bolivia from the region's fastest growing economy into a state of collapse. The economy, the most recent figures show that the economy is in free fall, is contracted 11% in terms of GDP. Unemployment has more than tripled. And that is just 1 year of neoliberal rule. So to pull the country out of that crisis, it's going to need someone who can think big in terms of economics and who knows what they're doing. And that's, of course, going to be the biggest obstacle going forward for this government, is that the country was left in such a bad position with a mountain of illegitimate debt. So the process of recovering that, the process of bringing Bolivia back on its feet is going to be an extremely difficult one. But Luis Arce is someone who's already done it. In 2005, when he arrived at the economy ministry, the country had been governed by the former neoliberal president, Carlos Mesa, and he'd left the country again under a pile of illegitimate IMF debt. In fact, in his resignation speech, he told the country that it's impossible to nationalize natural gas, because the IMF had told him so. And the state is in such a crisis that even public sector salaries were having to be paid by the IMF through IMF loans. An extraordinarily irresponsible situation to be in. Of course, taking out loans for investment in future growth is one thing. Now, taking out loans to cover your basic costs is disastrous. It's like taking out credit to pay one's rent or one's bills. That's an extremely difficult situation. That's very different from taking out a loan to invest in a small business or in your work, something that could bring earnings for you in the future. So Bolivia's economy has been destroyed by neoliberal figures who thought they were more intelligent because they've studied in the United States. They thought that they were superior because they weren't indigenous, because they had degrees from fancy schools. However, the reality is they destroyed the economy, and now it's the turn of the country's indigenous social movements and workers' movements to rebuild it, just like they did in 2005 when Evo Morales first took power. Yeah, I think something incredibly interesting and inspirational that's happened since the MAS has taken power is some of the most persecuted figures of the last year are now taking leading roles within the state. Patricia Arce is one of them. She's now a senator for Cochabamba. But this time last year, in November last year, she was the mayor of a small town called Vinto outside Cochabamba. And far-right protesters from the group known as the Resistencia Juvenil Cochala kidnapped her, tortured her. They made her walk over broken glass. They cut her hair, doused her in petrol and red paint. And they told her that they're walking her to her death. And they were trying to get her to resign and to condemn Evo Morales. She refused to do both. And so they tortured her. Eventually, police managed to rescue her. But she was turned into a figure of bravery, not just within Bolivia, but internationally. And that wasn't the only abuse that she suffered under the coup. After that took place, after the coup took power, she was persecuted throughout that whole time. I interviewed her during the election campaign. She told me that she had 17 criminal charges hanging over her, again for the same things as others: terrorism, sedition. She was arrested on 2 occasions. The whole year was a nightmare for her. But now she fought an election campaign, and now she's a senator for the Department of Cochabamba. And I'm told someone I know, as soon as the victory was clear, as soon as the results were announced, a friend of mine rang her, and Patricia Arce said that she couldn't speak. She was crying with happiness. She said, for the first time in a year, I'll be able to go to sleep and know that there's not the threat of being taken away. So that's something incredibly important. There's so many other figures as well. The president of the Senate now is Andrónico Rodriguez. He was the leader of the 6 federations of the Tropico of Cochabamba, which is the union that Evo Morales once led. He again had around 15, 16 criminal charges hanging over him, a number of attempts to arrest him. Now he's the president of the Senate. And there's so many other stories. There's the head of the country's identification services, Patricia Hermosa. She was Evo Morales' secretary, and she was in jail for most of this past year. There's so many others like that. When the coup took place, what we saw was the country's social movement leaders, trade union leaders, indigenous leaders, completely swept out of the halls of power, of the halls of government, and replaced by those who assumed that they were socially superior because they studied in the United States. But actually what we've seen now is those grassroots leaders come back into the halls of power. Wendy Perez is now the director of the government's Service for Women and Depatriarchalization. And she was an Afro-Bolivian leader from the Yungas region in La Paz. There's other figures, Rolando Bordas, known as Flaco Borda. He was a trade union leader in the city of Santa Cruz, a historic leader of workers in that city, which is the industrial heart of Bolivia. When the coup took place, the far right seized his union's officers, assaulted key trade union officers, and he was forced into hiding. The whole year he was in hiding. He hasn't gone public about where he was at that time. He was forced to flee, and now just the other week he came back to a hail of cheers from his comrades to retake the offices of the unions, of the trade unions in Santa Cruz, back as an institution that is part of the process of change in Bolivia. That is part of the exercise of power in Bolivia, because the mass isn't governing just as a political party that's taking power. It governs in conjunction with the country's social movements and trade unions. So the return of Flaco Borda is the return of the mass and of a popular government to the region of Santa Cruz, which is traditionally a more conservative region of the country. When the victory of the movement towards socialism first became clear, their first reactions of the most extremist elements was to reject it. And what we saw in the days leading up to Luis Arce being sworn in was violent protests in the city of Santa Cruz and in the city of Cochabamba. The same far-right extremist elements that led the protests against Evo Morales were once again trying to cause chaos on the streets. They were blocking roads. They were assaulting indigenous people. However, that message of hate, didn't get through to the wider population, not even to the country's middle and upper class as a whole, because the country realized that the mass had won. These far-right groups were alleging that there'd somehow been electoral fraud once again. However, the country realized that everyone suffered during the past year. Everyone became poorer due to the series of neoliberal reforms that had taken place under the coup. And everyone had the experience of rising living standards and being pulled out of poverty under Luis Arce as Evo Morales as economy minister. So the victory was overwhelming and it was very clear. So the right now is divided between its more institutional, liberal end, which accepts the results, accepts their defeat, but is of course critical and is still attacking the mass. And then on the other wing, you've got the extremist elements, especially in the city of Santa Cruz, groups like the Unión Juvenil Cruceñista, Comité Cívico, really the fascist elements that led the protests against Evo Morales, but who are now much more isolated. Those who were marching with them see them as extremists. So that's a contradiction they're going to have to work out amongst themselves. The right is now even more divided than it was last year. So it's going to be a very long time before they retake power, chiefly because they don't understand the country. They don't understand that the majority of Bolivians have never supported the privatization of natural resources. They don't understand that the vast majority of Bolivians believe that government should be carried out in conjunction with the country's indigenous nations. So if they oppose those key values that unites the majority of Bolivians, they'll keep losing elections. They'll be out of power for another 20 years. One military commander has been arrested, and yesterday he was given preventive detention for his role in the massacre of Sacaba. Something quite disconcerting is happening in that a number of military figures have publicly come out to say that they condemn his arrest. However, I think the military is having to come to terms with the fact that their role in the country is to protect the elected government and the country's constitution. Those far-right elements, those right-wing conservative elements within the military that led the coup last year, have now been removed. Throughout the past year, the former coup president Agnes tried to reorganize the military. She promoted a number of conservative factions to the highest positions. Those people have been swept away. There's now a new leadership in both the military and the police, installed by Luis Arce's government. Absolutely necessary reform. An elected government, can't govern if it doesn't have control of both the police and military. If the police and military is responding to other forces, if it's responding to bribes by the country's oligarchy or to orders from the United States, that's not a way to govern the country. The military and the police have to be institutions that are there to serve the people, the majority of the people, to serve their interests. And the interest of the Bolivian people right now is to recover the economy, to beat back the oligarchy that imposed the coup last year, and to rebuild what they destroyed through neoliberal reforms. That's the project that the military and the police have to work towards now. The return of Evo Morales was possibly the most important moment in Bolivian history. I was there. He in the town of Villazon, which is a border town with Argentina, and he came walking across the bridge with Argentina's president Alberto Fernandez. And I mean, just personally, I had quite a good spot ready to film, and there was a number. His comrades from the unions, the campesino unions in the Tropic of Cochabamba, were there as security, and they're supposed to hold people back. But the moment he stepped on Bolivian soil, just a mass of humanity just sort of descended, and all the security that was supposed to be there just sort of dissolved under the sheer weight of people. Everyone just trying to touch him, trying to get a look, even for a few seconds. And I mean, filming for me became impossible as being, thrown around, being squashed by just masses and masses of people from all around the country had come to the border to receive him. And from there, what we did, we're part of his convoy, 3-day tour. We went from the Argentinian border through Potosí, Oruro, Cochabamba, and finishing here in the Tropico. And everywhere he went, he is received as a father figure. People were crying, and not just in the rallies that were scheduled. When we were driving, every small rural community that was along the motorway came out to block the roads to, say, demand that he comes out. They were desperate to see him, to touch him, and so he did. He came out. People ran up to offer him their produce, offer him. One elderly lady just sort of ran in and just gave him a load of onions that she just picked from her land. That was the atmosphere, and it was just so different to how things were when he was president. Of course, when he was president, there was certain state protocol. He went around in a helicopter, but now we did 3 days pure by land in cars, and he spoke to the country not as the government, but as a leader, as a natural leader of people, of social movements. So it was a much more organic feel to when he was president last year. Evo Morales is not in government. However, his role is as the leader of the mass, of the movement towards socialism. He's the president of the party. And what he's been doing since he's been back is going around the country and also having delegations from social movements around the country visit him here to discuss how to rebuild the party, how to strengthen the party for future challenges, how to strengthen the link between social movements and the state and the party. So that's the role of Evo Morales, is a political role, as a political leader at the social movement level, and bridging that gap between the social movements and the state is a role he's already played in the past. Throughout the 90s and the early 2000s, he was the leader of the unions in the Tropico Cochabamba. He led the struggle against US aid, against the DEA in this region. And he built the party and spoke to the whole country. And that's what he's going to be doing again. And not just within Bolivia. He's using his platform as a social movement leader here to speak to the world. Already he's received delegations from indigenous groups in Ecuador, in Peru, from trade unions in Argentina. And he's already announced that there's going to be a conference here in the Tropic of Cochabamba at the end of December, a pan-Latin American conference of the social movements in the whole of the region to build new organizations for the integration of Latin America, but on the basis of anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism. So Evo Morales is going to be a political leader within Bolivia, but also a leader on an international level to guide social movements at an international level. What he wants to do is share the experience of Bolivia, how Bolivia beat a coup in just 1 year, how they beat an enormously powerful enemy in just 1 year. Share that experience with social movements, trade unions, and around the world so that people can beat their own ruling class. The Latin American left never went away, in a sense. Countries such as Ecuador, Bolivia, where left-wing governments were swept away, they weren't swept away at the ballot box. They were swept away by coups, by betrayals within the state. Latin American left has always represented a majority of people in a number of countries who experienced the way in which millions of people were lifted out of poverty through policies such as the nationalization of natural resources and the country's most important industries, not just in Bolivia, but throughout the region. People have that experience and it can't go away. And so what we're going to see, what we've already seen in Bolivia is going to be replicated in Ecuador very soon. They have elections coming up in a few months. Again, Ecuador's a country in a very similar situation to Bolivia, where the left has been persecuted, its leaders driven out of the country, an intense media war against the left there. But what do we see? Once again, the left is ahead in the polls. In Peru, a country where the left was persecuted almost out of existence under the military dictatorship of the 1990s, what we see now is all the anger that's built up for decades around social inequality, around the poverty that the country lives in, burst out, mass protests, not just in Peru, countries like Guatemala. We're going to see that throughout the region because despite the fact that the Latin American right has the power of the media, has the backing of the United States, but all they've brought to the region is poverty and suffering. And people know that, and no amount of media spin can change people's experience of violence and poverty under neoliberal rule. And no amount of media spin can change people's experience of dignity, of sovereignty, of being pulled out of poverty by the region's governments that have governed from the left. Many times throughout history, the big ideological clashes in Latin America are about universal issues. So what every country around the world is facing at the moment is how do we rebuild our economies after the pandemic, after having to close down economic activity. And now the ideological debate in Latin America shows the two paths there is for all the peoples of the world. Either you pay for the recovery and pay for what was spent during the pandemic by brutal austerity, by neoliberal shock doctrine, or you force the burden of the recovery to be paid by those with the broader shoulders, by those who have lived off exploitation for so many years. And that's what Bolivia and Argentina are doing. They're introducing a wealth tax. In Bolivia, it's going to be a permanent wealth tax, a permanent annual wealth tax. And that's how they're going to pay to rebuild the economy, to rebuild the country's infrastructure, to rebuild internal consumer demands in the economy, and to bring back employment. Those are the two paths that lay not just for Bolivia, not just for Latin America, but for all the world. So I think is an example of how it's incredibly important for everyone around the world, everyone who is fighting neoliberalism around the world, to look to Bolivia. Look how the social movements beat an incredibly powerful enemy. Look how they're rebuilding the country, how they're rebuilding a post-neoliberal economy. The Bolivian people have shown that it's possible for people to win. It's not inevitable for protest movements, social movements to be in a situation of permanent oppositional protest. It is actually possible for those movements to beat the ruling class and take power and govern oneself. That's what Bolivia shows. And I think it's a lesson that has to be exported to everywhere. Because there's nothing special about Bolivians or about Bolivian culture. This is something that can take place in every corner of the globe. It's something that needs to take place in every corner of the globe. Because all around the world, people face the same problems. They face the same problems of poverty, of climate catastrophe, of inequality. And these are things that can be built. These are things that can be beaten through taking lessons of Bolivia's experience, of how Bolivia nationalized natural resources and key industries to lift millions of people out of poverty, to building a democratic political model for governance in which social movements and trade unions participate in the exercise of power. These are things that can be applied everywhere around the world and should be applied everywhere around the world. I was banned numerous times, I think 4 times on Twitter, as were the accounts for the news outlet that we run, which is Calsacha News. There's a number of reasons. It's not just me. A number of union leaders and other left-wing journalists in Bolivia suffered the same fate. There's a huge operation, troll farm operation that exists in Bolivia. Some of it operated from the United States. It was revealed a few months ago that a company called CLS Strategies, with its headquarters in Manhattan, were operating huge social media, you could say, guerrilla operations in Bolivia, Venezuela, and Mexico. They were running fake accounts, fake sort of political pages supporting right-wing causes in Bolivia, Venezuela, and Mexico. So I think there's nothing organic about the social media activity on the right, and it's something that's not talked about in the West. I think in the West, in the United States in particular, there's a lot of talk about Russian bots, Russian meddling, without a huge deal of evidence. However, there are huge centers of operation within the United States for intervening in social media in Latin America to support the interests of the US government in that region. So I think that's something that needs to be talked about. But of course, the being banned or censored on social media was certainly the least of our worries throughout the past year. Um, I work at a radio station here in Bolivia called Radio Causation Coca. Throughout the whole year, we received information from the patriotic sections within the military and the police that plans were being drawn up by the government to seize control of the radio. One of my colleagues, Orlando Marco, was arrested while he was reporting on a trade union event in the south of the country in Chuquisaca. That was something that was permanently hanging over us for the whole of the last year. And in fact, we're here at the offices now, and throughout most of the last year, we had what was called a vigilia, where local union members in the town that we're in, Laucaenia, surrounded the radio station day and night. People slept there, took turns to sleep overnight to protect the radio station, because people felt that it was the only weapon, the only informational weapon that people had to denounce the abuses of the coup regime, to give a voice to the people who are struggling for democracy. So yeah, certainly being censored on Twitter is something that's worrying, but it wasn't our most pressing concern of the past year.